Berlin, May 1945. The war in Europe was over, but the violence was. The city didn't fall with a dramatic final battle or a single moment of surrender. It collapsed slowly, block by block, apartment by apartment, stairwell by stairwell. Smoke still hung in the air. Rubble covered the streets. And silence felt unnatural, like something terrible was about to happen. German women stepped out of basements and cellars where they had hidden for weeks. Some carried children, others carried nothing at all. They moved carefully, unsure which sound might bring soldiers back. The Red Army had arrived. For millions of Germans, this wasn't liberation. It was fear. The Soviet soldiers who entered Berlin were not fresh troops. They were survivors. Men who had marched thousands of miles from Stalingrad to the German capital. Men who had seen their villages burned, their families murdered, their friends buried in mass grave. They had fought through Ukraine, Poland, and East Prussia. They had seen what the German invasion had done to the Soviet Union. Entire cities erased. Civilians executed. Women violated. Children starved. For many of these soldiers, Berlin wasn't just the enemy's capital. It was the source of everything they had lost. And that mattered. Officially, the Red Army came as liberators. Unofficially, many soldiers came for revenge. Years of propaganda had taught them that Germans were monsters. Years of war had convinced them that mercy was weakness. When discipline collapsed, rage filled the gap. German women, especially civilians, became symbols, not individuals, symbols of the enemy nation. This wasn't ordered from Moscow, but it wasn't stopped either. In the chaos of victory, lines blurred, authority weakened, commanders struggled to control exhausted, traumatized troops. And civilians paid the price. In Berlin and across Eastern Germany, women hid wherever they could. They cut their hair short. They dressed as elderly women. They covered their faces with ash and dirt. Some painted themselves to look sick. Others hid children under floorboards and inside walls. Many carried poison, believing death was safer than capture. They knew what had happened in East Prussia. Word had spread ahead of the Red Army. Fear traveled faster than tanks. Historians still argue about numbers. But even conservative estimates agree on one thing. The scale was massive. Hundreds of thousands, possibly more, of German women were assaulted in the weeks and months following Berlin's fall. This happened in cities, in villages, in refugee camps, in homes already shattered by war. It wasn't constant everywhere, it wasn't every soldier. But it was widespread enough that silence became impossible. Hospitals filled with women suffering physical and psychological trauma. Doctors quietly treated victims, knowing the subject was dangerous to discuss. Shame followed survivors more closely than sympathy. No group was completely safe. Young women, elderly women, pregnant women, girls barely in their teens. Marital status offered no protection. Motherhood offered no shield. Even women who had opposed the Nazi regime suffered. To the soldiers, guilt was collective. German meant enemy. The Red Army command knew what was happening. Reports reached Soviet leadership within days. Some officers tried to stop it, some punished offenders, others looked away. The reality was brutal. There were too many soldiers, too much destruction, too much hatred. Stalin himself reportedly dismissed complaints, saying his soldiers had earned the right after what they had endured. That single attitude shaped everything. When leadership excuses violence, it spreads. This story has no simple villains. Many Soviet soldiers protected civilians. Some escorted women, safely through streets. Others shot fellow soldiers for crimes against civilians. There were acts of humanity, quiet ones that rarely make it into history books. But they existed alongside brutality. And the victims remembered both. German women adapted quickly. Some formed groups, believing safety existed in numbers. Others sought protection from officers instead of enlisted men. Some entered relationships out of desperation, trading safety for silence. These choices weren't consent. They were survival. And history often forgets the difference. The war left behind children who didn't fit neatly into post-war society. Children born to German mothers and Soviet fathers often grew up stigmatized. They carried visible reminders of violence their mothers never spoke about. Many mothers never told them the truth. Silence became inheritance. When American and British forces entered Western Germany, discipline was stricter. Abuse happened, but on a much smaller scale, and offenders were more often punished. This contrast deepened German fear of the East. Refugees fled west whenever possible, risking bombings and starvation rather than face Soviet occupation. For civilians, ideology mattered less than survival. After the war, no one wanted to talk. In East Germany, discussing Soviet crimes was forbidden. In the Soviet Union, it was unthinkable. In the West, it complicated the narrative of liberation. German women learned quickly that their suffering had no place in politics. They were expected to rebuild, to forget, to stay quiet. And many did for decades. Only in the late 20th century did historians begin listening. Diaries surfaced. Hospital records were examined. Oral histories recorded voices that had been silent for 50 years. These women didn't seek revenge. They sought acknowledgement, to be believed. This story is uncomfortable because it breaks simple narratives. The Red Army defeated Nazism. That was necessary. That was just. But justice in war is rarely clean. People can be victims and perpetrators in the same lifetime. And victory doesn't erase trauma. This history didn't disappear by accident. It was erased because it was inconvenient. It challenged heroism. It questioned liberation. It reminded the world that war doesn't end when flags change. Silence was easier. The day after Berlin fell did not feel like victory. Women stepped into the streets cautiously, scanning doorways and corners. Many had slept in the same clothes for weeks. Some hadn't slept at all. Their faces were gray with exhaustion, their eyes constantly moving. They didn't know which uniform meant danger anymore. Soviet soldiers were everywhere, resting on sidewalks, sleeping in doorways, laughing loudly in groups. Some waved. Some ignored civilians completely. Others stared in ways that made women turn and walk faster. Fear didn't announce itself. It lingered. During the final weeks of the battle, Berlin's cellars became a second city. Families crowded underground with whatever food they had left. Candles flickered. Air grew thick and damp. Children cried softly until mothers learned how to silence them, not with anger, but with fear. Women knew the danger came when soldiers searched buildings. Some cellars were passed over. Others were not. Afterward, women emerged changed, quieter, older. And the city kept moving. One of the cruelest aspects of what followed Berlin's fall was what happened afterward. Silence. Many women told no one, not husbands, not parents, not doctors. They feared judgment more than they feared memory. In a culture already crushed by defeat, shame became another punishment layered onto trauma. Some women blamed themselves for surviving. Others convinced themselves it hadn't happened. History rarely records silence, but silence leaves scars. Berlin's hospitals filled quickly. Doctors treated injuries they didn't write down. Midwives handled pregnancies they didn't discuss. Medical staff learned to ask questions without words. Records were vague. Euphemisms replaced facts. Everyone understood the danger of clarity. Doctors weren't cowards. They were survivors too. As Germany split into East and West, the silence hardened into law. In East Germany, the Soviet Union was no longer an occupying force. It was a brother nation. To criticize the Red Army was to criticize the state itself. Women who spoke risked losing jobs, losing housing, losing children. So they learned something harder than fear: erasure. Their stories disappeared from textbooks, newspapers, and public memory. They were told the past was settled. It was. In the West, the topic wasn't forbidden, but it wasn't welcomed either. Talking about German suffering complicated guilt. It risked blurring the lines between victim and perpetrator. And post-war Germany desperately needed moral clarity. So the stories stayed private. Kitchen conversations, late-night confessions, unspoken glances between women who recognized each other. Years later, children noticed. Why don't we talk about the war? Why won't you answer that question? Why do you hate Russians? Mothers changed the subject. Some couldn't look their children in the eyes when asked. Because how do you explain violence without passing it on? Many never tried. In the 1990s, something changed. The Cold War ended. Archives opened. The fear loosened its grip. Historians began listening, not to generals, but to civilians. Women in their 70s and 80s finally spoke. Not angrily, not dramatically, matter-of-factly, as if they had been waiting their entire lives for permission. They didn't want revenge. They didn't want punishment. They wanted recognition. They wanted history to stop pretending that victory erased everything. Many said the same thing. We survived, but we were never the same. This story isn't one-sided. Some Soviet veterans spoke later as well. They talked about guilt, about things they saw, about things they couldn't stop. They talked about commanders who lost control, about alcohol, about rage that had nowhere to go. War didn't end for them either. It followed them home. There's a hard truth here. Wars aren't fought by nations. They're fought by people. And when systems collapse, it's the powerless who pay first. Women, children, civilians. Always. Berlin was not unique. It was simply one of the last times the world looked away. We like clean history. Heroes on one side, villains on the other. A clear ending. But real war refuses simplicity. The Red Army defeated Nazi Germany. That matters. But acknowledging suffering doesn't undo victory. It deepens understanding. Because silence repeats itself. Because every modern war creates civilians who carry invisible wounds. Because pretending our side is incapable of cruelty guarantees it will happen again. Memory is prevention. This story isn't about blaming Russians. It's about remembering women. It's about honoring lives lived in fear and silence. It's about refusing to use history as propaganda. Berlin today is bright. Cafes, museums, tourists laughing where ruins once stood. Most people walk past buildings without knowing what happened in their basements. That's normal. Life moves on. But history doesn't disappear just because it's uncomfortable. Many women took this history to their grave. Not because they forgot, but because no one ever asked. They became mothers, grandmothers, neighbors who smiled politely. Inside, the memories stayed exactly where the war left them. Some woke at night decades later, heart racing, unsure why. Others avoided certain streets, certain smells, certain sounds. Trauma doesn't fade. It waits. Silence has consequences. When stories aren't told, patterns repeat. Every generation believes its war will be different. That discipline will hold. That humanity will prevail. And every generation is proven wrong. Not because people are evil, but because war gives fear permission. Telling this story isn't about excuses. Understanding why something happened is not the same as forgiving it. The Red Army's suffering was real. So was German civilian suffering. History can hold both truths at once. In fact, it must. Because when we simplify the past, we weaken the future. There's a reason these stories surface late. Wars are written by commanders, by politicians, by men with medals and microphones. Women's suffering rarely fits victory speeches, so it's pushed aside. But history isn't complete until civilians are included, especially the ones who had no weapons. Remembering isn't about reopening wounds. It's about refusing to let them be erased. These women didn't ask to be symbols. They didn't ask to represent nations. They wanted safety. That's all. After 1945, the world rushed forward. Reconstruction, alliances, Cold War politics. There was no room for quiet suffering. So the women rebuilt anyway. Brick by brick, family by family. History called it recovery. They called it survival. Not guilt, not anger. Attention. Attention to the fact that war doesn't end when treaties are signed. Attention to civilians who pay for decisions they never made. Attention to voices that were silenced because they were inconvenient. Because wars are still happening. Because civilians are still trapped between armies. Because every time we ignore uncomfortable history, we give permission for it to happen again. Memory is not weakness. It's defense. Somewhere in Berlin, an elderly woman once sat on a bench. No one knew her story. She watched children play where ruins once stood. She had survived, and history almost forgot her. This story doesn't belong to one country. It belongs to everyone who believes war should be remembered honestly. Not as legend, not as propaganda, but as lived experience. If this story made you uncomfortable, that's not a failure. That's the point. History isn't meant to comfort us. It's meant to teach us. If you believe forgotten voices deserve to be heard. If you believe war stories should include civilians, not just generals. If you believe truth matters more than simple narratives, then help keep these stories alive. Like the video. Share it with someone who cares about real history. And subscribe to WWII Records for stories history tried to erase, but shouldn't. Because remembrance is the only victory that lasts.